I'm J.G. Michael, and this is Parallax Views. This edition of Parallax Views is brought to you by the $10 and above tier supporters of Parallax Views on Patreon. So, with that in mind, producers credit shoutouts to Galen, Matt, Gunnar, Mark, Simon, Alexander, Catherine, G, Tilo, Emilia, Jeremy, Jeff, John, Bert, Brian, Elliot, Michael, Brace, James, Nick, Mersham, Galen, Arlen, Bo, Christopher, Michael, Gigadelic Media, Chance, Chase, Dan, Big Bob, David H, Y. Kellerman, Sadeed 13, Kathleen, David, Ava, Bob, The West Bank Robbery Podcast, Jamie, Enoch, Gary, Max, Ishtofer, James, Martin, Matthew Ho, Brian, Nobody, Thomas, and Dano. And now on to the show. Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. As always, I'd like to remind you that you can support me if you enjoy this show by heading on over to patreon.com/parallaxviews. I've been very, very appreciative of those who have pitched in some donations this month, so I won't go on about my Patreon that much longer. I will remind listeners on the intros of this show that they can contribute, but you've really helped out so far, those of you who have pitched in. Anyone else that wants to pitch in can do so at patreon.com/parallaxviews. And with that out of the way, on this edition of the show, we're going to be joined by Dr. Reverend Liz Theoharis, co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign and director of the Kairos Center for Religions, Rights, and Social Justice at Union Theological Seminary in New York City, to discuss an article she recently co-wrote that can be found on TomDispatch, Counterpunch, and The Nation, dealing with the controversial Project 2025 and Pax Romana. We'll also be discussing the rise of Christian nationalism politically over the years and the Christian left opposition to the Christian nationalist agenda, the connection between militarism, militarization, and the war on the poor, bipartisan support for the military-industrial complex, and the horrors we are seeing unfolding in Gaza, and much, much more. So with that being said, let's get right to it with Dr. Reverend Liz Theoharis. Welcome to Parallax Views, a guest that I'm very happy to be speaking with. Dr. Reverend Liz Theoharis is the co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign and director of the Kairos Center for Religion, Rights, and Social Justice. And she recently co-wrote a piece that caught my eye. It's been featured everywhere from Counterpunch to The Nation to, I believe, originally TomDispatch. And it dealt with Project 2025 as a new Pax Romana. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
So let's get into it. My listeners are familiar with 2025 at this point, but what is your specific analysis of Project 2025?
Well, I think what's really important in Project 2025 is some of the Christian nationalist, the white Christian nationalist influences and roots of it, as well as obviously the content. I think it's really significant that actually the longest section of it is focusing on social and economic policy. I think a lot of times we kind of maybe skim over the fact that this kind of right-wing extremist takeover of the society that is extremely anti-democratic and, has changed all kinds of changes in governance, also is fundamentally also connected to attacking housing programs and social welfare programs and healthcare and Social Security, and even any kind of regulation of the environment or of the Food and Drug Administration or any of these kinds of things. And so the fact that there's so much in there about really cutting and transforming and maybe even eliminating public education, I think we have to pay attention to this.
And I would add, since it's a big issue for me, I cover a lot of labor issues. I mean, this is really bad for workers' rights too.
Really bad, really bad. And it really is an attack on poor and low income people and all people that work in this society, and that don't have just generational wealth. If you're a corporation, you maybe are going to be okay, especially if you're a wealthy multinational one. But if you're an average person in this country, Project 2025 is just bad news.
I know this is a little bit outside the scope of the article, but what do you think brought us to this point where, Christian nationalists have sort of become so prominent in our society, to the point where I think a lot of people, when they hear Christian now, they sort of think, oh, you must be a right winger, or you must, and it's kind of annoying to me as a Catholic with very left-leaning views that people have this perception, but it's because Christian nationalism has really become such a force politically in this country. How did we get to this point?
Well, I think this is a really important point. I mean, the fact that there's almost an equal sign between Christian and extremists these days, it's profoundly troubling, and it doesn't just impact, it impacts everybody. And it's a huge distortion. I would agree with you of our faith traditions, but there has been a long fought political movement, and I say political. It's not a religious movement. It's a political movement that has gotten us to this place where, dating back, throughout history, throughout U.S. history, there have always been sections of Christianity that are very in line with extremism and racism and kind of the subjugation of people. So I'm even though I'm a pastor, even though I'm a theologian, I have a deep understanding of the problematic role that Christianity has played, whether it's starting with indigenous genocide to the U.S. chattel slavery system. But if we kind of fast forward to the 60s and 70s, that's where the birth of this modern kind of Christian nationalist movement starts and is taking place. And it's a huge reaction to the desegregation of schools, the threat of cutting public subsidies to Catholic and Christian institutions, like in schools, and unless they desegregated, is a key part in this. The kind of rise of the anti-abortion movement is a key part of this. But I think it all is also corresponds with neoliberalism and with the kind of redoing of the kind of what the government and society's relationship to the people should be. And so you have, at the same time as these Christian right leaders are kind of taking over seminaries, taking over denominations, actually sponsoring, preaching series to have folk come out, with a more prosperity gospel, is at the same time that some of our more progressive institutions are also, giving up the fight to have the government, have strong social welfare policies and a good public education system. And so, we've seen over the years more and more folks that are Christian extremists in positions of power. Obviously, like almost the coronation of it all is Speaker of the House Mike Johnson, the third highest position in government, with an outright Christian nationalist, in that role, and and now what we're looking at with Project 2025, whether it's ever fully implemented, and actually on some level, no matter who wins this election, more and more of these Christian right policies are becoming kind of mainstream in the center of our government.
Well, that was a good lead into the next question I was going to ask you, because you read my mind there. A lot of us are focused on Project 2025, but in a way, a part of that Project 2025 plan, that regressive plan that we see in Project 2025, is already being carried out by the Supreme Court. How important is it that we keep our eye on what the Supreme Court is doing right now?
Well, I think it's the Supreme Court and a bunch of those federal and district courts that really matter a lot. And what we've had is that not democratically elected, not winning the popular vote presidents have been able to put into the Supreme Court and into other courts so many justices that right now so many of the decisions are being made by folks that were not elected by the people to be making those decisions, and it's very scary, right? I mean, from the criminalization of the unhoused to the kind of taking away of any kind of regulations around environment or other issues, to saying that the president is above the law. They're just a couple of examples of this, but I think then when you couple that with what's happening in state legislatures across the country, and with the shift of so much of the power and autonomy of states to be able to determine what policies they're putting forward in their states, I think you see the courts and you see these state legislatures and you see all of this extremism that actually is not what the vast majority of people in the country want, are voting for, are interested in, or have any interest in. And yet somehow, we're seeing at the same time as people desire living wages, are demanding healthcare, want a better education for their kids, think there should be debt relief, and should have expanded voting rights and environmental protections. At the same time, we have these state legislators and we have these courts that are kind of ruling on behalf of corporations and the very rich.
You mentioned this idea in the article of Pax Romana, the ancient world of the Pax Romana. How do you see that as being analogous to the situation we see ourselves in today?
Well, I think that there was, a whole series of kind of a worldview that was the Pax Romana. And here you have the word Roman peace, right? Pax Romana. But how that peace was spread, and I put peace in quotes there, was through war and subjugation and militarization. And it was coupled with kind of policies that were controlling who could relate to who and how. And so, we have this notion of like the widespread infrastructure development and spreading of peace and well-being and this kind of golden age of morality. That's what all of those what kind of historians and social historians especially will talk about these years of the Roman Empire that were kind of ruled by this Pax Romana. And yet, like, what the underside of all of that was marriage laws that outlawed, who could marry who. What was the underside of all of that is all of the war and all of the conflict and all of the poverty. And I think it's similar today, right? I mean, we have these Christian nationalists who are kind of putting forward, they're talking about morality and the moral issues of our day. They're talking about how they're here for unity and peace and all of that, right? And yet, we have a bloated Pentagon budget. We have, more and more conflict in this country and around the world, and we have, vast and deep poverty. I mean, about 40% of the U.S. population right now is living in poverty or a couple $100 away from absolute economic ruin, right? It's not so different. I mean, there are surely differences, but it's not so different than this kind of Pax Romana, and the underside of the Roman Empire, as we can see today.
So that brings me to the portion of the article dealing with how extremist Republican politicians are sort of aligning with this, war economy, pro-militarist view. But in a lot of ways, in both uh, major parties, we've seen a sort of allying with the military-industrial complex. How do you see the problem of militarism as being connected to other issues such as poverty and labor rights? Because I think there is an interconnectivity.
Yeah, I think it's really important for us to see. I mean, more than half of the federal discretionary budget is spent on the military, and a very small part of that same budget is spent on healthcare or living wages or education or anti-poverty programs. And, as a Christian pastor, like where your treasure is, that's where your heart is, right? Well, it looks like then, according to that the United States' heart is very close to war and militarism. We spent $21 trillion since 9/11, 2001 on militarization, whether that's war, declared and undeclared, whether that's the kind of militarization of our borders, whether that's other things in homeland security. If we were to spend $21 trillion on expanding Head Start and raising people's wages and expanding healthcare, I mean, we would be living in a wholly different society. I mean, just one contract with Lockheed Martin, could pay for kids to go to 4 years of college for free, right? This is the kind of military spending that this country is so used to, and there is really a bipartisan consensus on this kind of military spending.
Well, we see it especially with, the bipartisan support for this just horror show that we're seeing in Gaza.
For sure, for sure. I mean, like, despite the fact that there are huge sections of our population, especially young people, across race, across religion, calling for a ceasefire now, calling for, an end to genocide, and an end to, ethnic cleansing. Despite the fact that lots of folks for, since the attack happened on October 7th, and hostages were taken, and then this kind of siege of Gaza, shortly after, there have been people across the nation, the United States, that, has a third of our naval capacity right now, standing at ready, for war in the Middle East right now. We hear people saying we should have more aid, we should have more humanitarian aid. We should be helping to, end starvation, and yet there is this bipartisan consensus that it's war, 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 and war is actually a strong word for even what's happening. I mean, it's really just a bombardment of women and children and civilians, and really hurting a lot of people, killing them.
Can you talk more about the war we're seeing at home? The war on the poor, as you refer to it in the article. I know you talk a little bit in that piece about Reverend Savina Martin, a military veteran and formerly homeless mother, who took the stage of the Poor People's Campaign's mass assembly in D.C. back in June. Maybe we could talk a little bit about that.
Well, I mean, again, this connection between the militarization of our communities and even just the poverty draft that exists in the country, right? We don't have a draft, but the vast majority of people who are in U.S. Services right now are poor and low income people, and it's because those are the jobs that people can get. That's the way people can get their education paid for. It's kind of described as one of the ways out of poverty in this rich nation. And then you can see the connection with the fact that then still frontline troops are paid sub-poverty wages, where many of their families still have to, get public assistance. 40% of single adults that are unhoused in this country are veterans, people who have served and given their life for the country, only to come back and not actually be able to, have anywhere to live. And then you also just look in general at the conditions of poverty in this rich country, where you have 140 million people who are poor and low income. You have 8 to 11 million people who are unhoused. You have just even the last year, 23 million people who have been jumped off, pushed off of the Medicaid rolls in the unwinding that happened after the COVID-19 pandemic was declared over. And so all of this results in both really actually hurting folks that have been in the military, like Reverend Savina and like lots of veterans that I know, and just shows that we are in fact finding money for everything in terms of war, but not to kind of lift the load of poverty.
Right.
And yet
we
have
can't, not to interrupt you, but it's like we can't guarantee housing, given, the homeless crisis in, say, a place like California, but for some reason we can fight all these wars. It's mind-boggling when you really think about it.
It really is. And I find a lot of use in like in some of the statistics that different policy institutes have put out there, but that people, I encourage people to kind of go to the National Priorities Project, for instance, and see, you can put in how much money your town is spending on militarism, and then you can see what else that could pay for, and it could pay for all kinds of teachers, it could pay for all kinds of housing, it could pay for all kinds of healthcare, and in fact, if we shifted some of the money that we were putting into the military, it would not only make us safer, because we wouldn't be fighting all these wars across the world, but also we could then invest it and improve people's lives here at the same time as improving people's lives abroad.
There's also that issue of the ways in which we criminalize the poor, more or less, through mass incarceration, deportations. Do you want to speak to that issue?
I mean, definitely, it's a crime, basically, to be poor in this country. If you can't kind of pay to play, we have lots of folks in our network in the Kairos Center who are too poor to die, right? Sometimes buried in these kind of mass graves, but also and Potter's Fields across the country. But in general, life is not easy, and life is getting shorter, and for everybody in this country, 800 people die every day from poverty. But then when you look at the kind of further criminalization of what it is to be poor, the Supreme Court just passed this kind of anti-homeless law where, and you referred to it already, that in California, folks are now being, their encampments are being destroyed and people are being arrested and fined for not having a place to live. If people have to kind of work under the table because they have to make ends meet, folks are being criminalized. And then at the same time, we're seeing a kind of deeper criminalization of people's right to speech and freedom of speech and right to protest and to kind of actually say, guess what? We want things to be better. This is not as good as it gets. And so we're going to try to organize around that. And so for sure, this criminalization problem is significant.
Is there anything else before we start wrapping up that you want to add about Project 2025? There's a lot. I mean, it's a 900-page document, so over 900 pages. And there's so much in there, ranging from, plans when it comes to food stamps, SNAP, ending housing first programs. I mean, it really is kind of this comprehensive war on the people.
That's right. And I appreciate you kind of going back to that and to raising that because again, I mean, we are talking a lot and I know your audience knows about Project 2525. And it's a significant threat because already these kinds of cuts are starting. And if Project 2025 gets to be put into full effect, I mean, we can kind of kiss many of the freedoms and the liberties that we have goodbye. And who's going to be hurt by it most are poor and low income people and just regular Americans who are just who want something better for this life, but who are surely not getting it from Project 2025.
Is there anything specifically in Project 2025 that is like most concerning to you, or because like in terms of nitty-gritty details, what do you think should be most upsetting to people?
Well, I mean, I think people should be upset that there's a 900-page document that is basically trying to take away your rights, take away your liberties, and take away any sense that the government is there to actually serve the people and not just the interests of the rich and corporations. But I think it's not hyperbole when we say, Project 2025 basically suggests the undoing of public education, that Project 2025 basically suggests, a complete deregulation of our environmental protections as well as what we eat and the food that we put in our bodies. I mean, these regulations, like whether it's for us getting on a plane or driving a car, like they exist for the betterment of the people. And you're going to try to get rid of all of this at the same time as punishing the poor first and worst by everything, whether it's, cutting housing or completely defunding any kind of programs of social uplift. And so I think it's important that the devil is in the details, and there's a lot of devil in a lot of those details because they're all each provision in Project 2025 is worse than the last one is, and they're all really bad.
What scares me is the fact that Project 2025 has been around for 2 years. This was all pretty much done in the open and coordinated by the Heritage Foundation. And now, even with the Trump campaign trying to say that it's not involved with Project 2025, if you look at Trump's manifesto, which I guess is known as Agenda 47, it's basically very similar to Project 2025, except maybe a bit more vague on details. I mean, I look at it and I see much of the same thing.
That's right.
And it's all being done in the open, which is the shocking part.
No, I think that's true. And I think what we've seen actually, in the Republican National Convention and really in the last couple of weeks, let alone over a longer period of time, is many of these extremists, saying the quiet part out loud. And so I think Project 2025 is a version of that. And we do know that there are direct connections between Trump and Project 2025, not the least of which is JD Vance, but also, half of his administration from the last administration was involved in some way in this Heritage Foundation, Project 2025. And so, and what we're seeing already, especially in these Republican legislators, is putting forward so many of the provisions that then make it into Project 2025. And so, I don't think we should be scared because, like, for the sake of being scared, but we should actually, if these folks are kind of mean enough to like be proposing all of these horrible cuts, then can we be hopeful enough to come together and build a movement from the bottom up that is led by people that are impacted to be able to say, this is not as good as it gets. Things don't have to be this way. Poverty and justice, poverty and injustice no more. Instead, we want justice for us all, and we can help to realize it.
I wanted to ask you about, do you think there is a role that Christians who are not fans of the Christian right, or people that would define themselves as part of a burgeoning Christian left, what role can they play in pushing back against all of this? And do you think I think it's underestimated how many Christians there are today that are challenging this sort of Christian nationalist mythology and have a different vision that's based in social justice.
So I think that's right, and I think we have to kind of preach that from the rooftops because again, because of that equating of extremism and Christianity. I mean, what we know about a bunch of the issues that the Christian nationalists are most organized around is that it's out of sync with where the majority of people are, including the majority of Christians. I mean, even the majority of Christians support a choice when it comes to abortion. And yet we think that being anti-choice is the only kind of Christian position on abortion. When it comes to the care and health care of transgender and not gender nonconforming folk, again, even the majority of Christians are there to be in support and in solidarity with transgender young people. When it comes to living wages, when it comes to healthcare, when it comes to housing, when it comes to SNAP and other kind of social benefits, the majority of Christians know that Jesus says, "When I was hungry, you gave me something to eat, and when I was, naked, you gave me some clothes, and that which you do to the least of these, who are most of us, you do to is the way that you honor and worship God." And I think there are a lot of people of faith. And we're meeting a lot of them in the Kairos Center. Like we're offering various programs, and so many pastors and preachers and congregants are coming forward trying to say, this is heresy, what these Christian nationalists are putting forward. And instead, our faith traditions say that we have to stop depriving the rights of the poor, like that prophet Isaiah says.
That's the last thing I wanted to get into. Maybe you could tell my listeners a little bit about the work that the Poor People's Campaign does and also the Kairos Center, the work that the Kairos Center does.
Yeah, so if you're interested in being a part of a spiritual and political community, the Kairos Center organizes a Freedom Church of the Poor. Come kind of worship and join us every Sunday evening at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. You can find more information at kairoscenter.org. We also offer a lot of resources and a lot of events, and we are always looking for people to join us. If you are anywhere in this country and you're interested in this upcoming election, the Poor People's Campaign is reaching out to 15 million poor and low income infrequent voters, and we need you to join us in our reaching out. And so you can go to poorpeoplescampaign.org. You can find who's doing that work in your state. You can reach out to folk there and get involved, because what we know is that a third of the US electorate are poor and low income people, and yet we very rarely hear about poverty from our politicians. And yet we have the power to really transform the whole political landscape from the bottom up, but only if we do it together. So I hope that folk your listeners will come join us at the Kairos Center and join us in the Poor People's Campaign, and help us to build a moral movement that says that everybody's got a right to live.
Real quick, I want to end on a positive note. So I wanted to say, I feel like there is sort of a sea change that I'm noticing, especially with young people. I was only in college a few years back, and I remember even, maybe 2, 3 years ago, I just remember young people at my college, it was a Catholic college, would say things to me like, there doesn't need to be, multi-billionaires in this world. No one should need that amount of money. And that, I mean, this is pretty much a popular sentiment I notice now. I think
Yeah.
people are voicing their discontent more, and I think people are really tired of, the rich get rich and the poor get poor being the status quo. And I was wondering if you could comment on that in closing.
Yeah, I mean, what we know is that it's when those that are most impacted, and in this moment, And with the futures that are in front of people, young people are deeply impacted, are the ones that can help us lead the way to a different society. I mean, and we need to build movements from the bottom up that and that's what people are doing right now. I mean, if we look around at some of the climate activism, if we look around in these calls for ceasefire and an end to genocide, when we look around and we see people, struggling and fighting for living wages, I think you can see and hear the kind of echoes of amazing transformative change. And so I spend much of my time in some of the poorest parts of this country and world, and feel incredibly hopeful that that we can actually come forward together and put forward a vision for society and help realize it, where everyone has a great place and can live a good life.
Well, thank you so much for coming on Parallax Views, Liz Theoharis.
Thank you so much. Have a great one.
Well, that does it for this edition of Parallax Views. As always, if you appreciate the work here I do on the show, please consider supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. And with that being said, until next time, you've been listening to Parallax Views with Parallax Views to Parallax Views with Parallax Views.
The way out is not simply to say, don't do it, just to prohibit. It's nothing else. If we don't do it, others will be doing it like crazy. So, we have to confront the problem. But no, basically, I know of the great anxieties, problems, new forms of control, but it's also new forms of freedom. This is why I always emphasize that internet and all this new digital stuff, it's a very ambiguous phenomenon, but it's the field of struggle. New forms of enslavement, but at the same time, new incredible forms of freedom. We have to accept the fight with no nostalgia for old, allegedly more authentic communities or whatever. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid.